Greetings and welcome back to another episode of Afterbirth modding tutorials, and in today's episode I'm going to show you how to use the input class. The input class is essentially a class or an object which allows us to interact with the player in a much more direct way. We can capture the inputs, the keystrokes, the mouse positions, the mouse clicks directly from the player and then do something with that. So you can imagine that you can add whole new dedicated buttons that do things. Maybe you can introduce second active items and then have separate buttons which activate them, or maybe you can even add the dodge roll ability and just set it to something like the Q button, and whenever you use it you would then execute a dodge roll. With that said, this is more of a demonstrative example, so it's not really anything spectacular, but I'm just gonna go through and explain you what the functions and maybe what the callbacks do, and then we can build on top of that. So let's get right into the code. So the first thing that we do is just register the mod, and then I have some helper variables here which I use throughout the code, but as we go through the functions I'll be explaining what it's do. The really first thing I want to focus on is the new callback called MC input action, and what this callbacks allows us to do is create new functions which work as an intermediary, so to say, between the player actions and inputs and what the game is actually receiving. So in this case I have two functions set up to kind of show off what I'm trying to say. The first one is called block shot, and essentially when we press a certain key press or a keystroke, we will block the shooting of the player, so that means even though you will be pressing the buttons, the player won't be even able to shoot. The second one is called drift, and when a certain button will be pressed again, the player will drift to the left. And you can see that the third parameter here are called input hooks, and input hooks are essentially hooks which allow us to kind of tell the game what we exactly want. In this case we have three input hooks. Input hook is action pressed, is action triggered, and get action value. Is action pressed is regarding to whatever you keep pressing a certain button, so that can be either true or false. So if you press the button to the right, for example, that means that the button action right will be true and the other ones will be false. And then if you have is action triggered, that means as soon as you press the button to the right, so when it switches from the off to on position, so to say, that is gonna be true for maybe like a few frames, and then it's not gonna be true anymore. The third one is called get action value, and that is regarding to analog inputs. So if you're moving to the left with a controller, you can either move very fast or very slow, but you can alter the speed between it, so you can move to something like half speed, and that is why we need these analog inputs to kind of work with it. Of course, if you're on the computer, this doesn't really apply to you, you can't really use it in any way, but I'm gonna be still showcasing you just maybe for completion's sake. This sounds a bit confusing, but let's get into the functions, and I think it'll make more sense when I actually show you what I mean. If you go in the first function called the block shot, you can see that first of all we have a variable called block shooting, and this is just a variable I set in another function, and basically when I press that button, we set the block shotting to true or false depending what it is. So essentially we're toggling whatever the player can shoot or not. And remember, this function is called all the time, so you can't really use this function to get what the player is pressing or maybe what they're saying, but you can use it to kind of block things or maybe change what the game is receiving based on what you want it to do. And in this case what I'm doing is I'm just saying if the button action is shoot up, shoot left, shoot right, or if the button action is shoot down, we're just telling the game false. You know, what we're saying is if you get these button actions, send the game that this is not happening. If you return false, we're just telling the game these actions are not happening, you should not be acknowledging them, and essentially what we do with this is disable the player from shooting. There are other button actions, for example like going to the pause menu, so if you want to be really evil, there could be an item which maybe increases your damage, but it doesn't allow you to pause the game anymore. That might seem a bit, mean, but this is something that this new callback allows us to do. The next function is called drift, and this utilizes the analog functions of the game of Isaac, or whatever you really want to focus on. But in this case what we do is if the drift left variable is true, we're just saying that the button action left should be 0.5. And this might seem, if you're pressing the left button, you will always go at half a speed, but essentially what it does, it makes you drift automatically to the left by 0.5, so half your maximum speed. And I know this might be confusing, you might be saying why would you really want to do these things this way, and you don't really have to. There's a ton of ways to do the same thing in Lua or just in coding in general. This is maybe one way of doing it, maybe a more elegant way of doing it, and definitely it serves a purpose. And if you want to block someone from shooting or moving, I think this might be the easiest way to do it, because it really does require just one if statement and just one return value. So now that we kind of have this covered, I want to focus on the other two functions which I have set up. The first function is called capture keys, and that is tied to the MC post update function, and the other one is called MC post render, and it's called capture keys faster. And that might seem a bit odd, but essentially the MC post render will be called much more frequently than MC post update. And you can see that MC post render, I have input is button triggered, and like I said before, the input hook is action triggered will be true when you kind of switch from the off to on position. So in this case, we check if the is button triggered key 4, so that's the 4 button, or just 4 when you press it on the keyboard. And because we want to capture that switch from the on or off to on position, we kind of need to check it every frame. And because render, MC post render, is called every frame, that means that this will work much more reliably than if we put this particular line in this one. Because what might happen is, let's say that if we put this is button triggered in this particular callback, MC post update is not called exactly every frame, which means that even though you press the button, it might not register sometimes. But in this case, what I do with the key 4, I just reverse the block shooting. So that is the variable which I use here. So when I press 4, that means that I disable shooting, or when I press 4 again, that means I enable it. So that's a toggleable ability, so to say. The next one is just the same, it's just for key 5, and it is the same just for the drift left function. The next one, which is maybe a bit more interesting, is the capture keys, which is tied to the MC post update. And this because here I check is button press, I'm not checking if I trigger the button, so if the button has switched from the off to on position, but here I check if the button is continuously pressed, which means we have to keep pressing that button for debug text to update. In this case, I just have 3 buttons. Key 1, key 2, and key 3. If it's key 1, what I do is just set debug text to number 1. If it's key 2, I get the mouse position with a new function called input get mouse position, and true or false are depending on whatever you want, game's coordinates or your local monitor coordinates. And again, that might seem a bit confusing, but essentially the game uses its own coordinate system and your monitor uses a different one. So yours uses something like resolutions, but in the game it might be different depending on what they do with the game. In this case, I just say true, which I think refers to game's coordinates. The third key refers to whatever we are shooting to the right. And essentially what we're doing here, like before, we're checking if a certain action is pressed. And in this case, if we are shooting to the right, this debug text will say shooting right is true, and if we are not shooting to the right, we'll be saying shooting right is false. And this might seem a bit confusing, but let's jump into the game and I'll be showing you what these buttons exactly do and how they behave in the game. Welcome to the game and our lovely debug text, and you can see that if we press number 1 shows up, and that's really not that spectacular. The number 2 key in this case just gives us our mouse position, so if we can kind of keep moving the mouse around, it just tells us the coordinates of our mouse, and if we let go of the number 2 key, you can see that it locks in place of regardless what the last value was. And this is just how we coded it, and of course it could work differently. The third button, in this case, just tells us whether we are shooting to the right or not. And you can see that it's false until action starts shooting to the right. And this doesn't work if I shoot in any other direction. The number 4 key in this case blocks shooting, and you can see that at first it was true, and every time I press the number 4 it switches from true to false or false from true. And if it's true, I can shoot normally, but if it's false, I can't shoot at all. And you can see that this is much better than what we had before, because previously what you would be able to do is maybe go through the tiers and just delete them from the game, but it would still play the animation. But with this method, what we're telling the game is that these input actions are not even happening and to just ignore them. And the last one is number 5, and when we press it on, we are drifting to the left, and we're always applying 0.5 speed to the left when this particular button is pressed. The next thing I really want to focus on, or maybe the last thing I want to really focus on, is even though our shooting is disabled and we can shoot, and we set the shooting right variable, which is on the number 3, even when we press the button to the right, it's still happening in the Lua file, so you can see that when I press the button to the right, it changes to true or false depending if it's pressed or not. But this doesn't mean that we can still capture the key input, so it's not false for the mod as well. It's just that the game interprets it as if we're not pressing that button. But in reality, we can still capture that particular input and do other things with it. So for example, if we want to introduce a custom shooting mechanic, which you want to maybe animate your own Isaac, maybe create a whole new beam or maybe a whole new effect, you can do that, and you can tell the game, don't shoot regular tears, and this is how you would do it, but you would still be able to capture the position or maybe which buttons the player is pressing, and then depending on that have a new mechanic or maybe a new tear effect which would apply to the player. So the last thing I really want to focus on in this case is the input namespace or class or objects or whatever you want to call it. And you can see that in my examples, I use the is button triggered, is button pressed, the get mouse position, and I think is action pressed. But you have some other functions which you can use, like is mouse button pressed. You can get action values or actual button values depending if you use analog sticks or not. And these are just some of the things you can use. You might be asking yourself, what is the difference between is action pressed or is button pressed? Is button pressed refers to the enumerators for the mouse, the keyboard, and that's about it. And the is action triggered or pressed refers to button actions. And essentially, button actions are all the actions that you can perform in the game. So for example, if an action is use the active item, that's not tied to the spacebar item, spacebar button, because some people might rebind it to another button, but you can always rely on the button action to give you whatever the action active item has been used. And of course, this goes for every other action in the game, like pausing the game, moving to the left, right, up, down, shooting, etc. Of course, the mouse and the keyboard just have all the regular keys you would expect. You can see the space, apostrophe, key 0, key 1, etc. And then you have the mouse button 1, 2, 3, etc. And the last one here is the input hook, which is just the 3 input hooks that I explained before, but you have them explained in the reference manual. If you want to look them up here, if you maybe don't want to type them yourself, you can just copy them. And this is really it, you know. When you just remember, when you want to do something that's regarding to the action of the player, use the button action. But if you want to introduce a new mechanic that's tied to a new button, you should use the keyboard, either the keyboard or the mouse enumerators, which tie to actual button presses and not the actions that the player entity does. So this is the end of this video, and I bet it was a bit more confusing than usual. It's probably because I didn't really explain myself well. So please, if you have any questions, ask me, because I think this is one of those things that has just a ton of potential. Because the API is constantly improving, we are getting new patches and updates. I can imagine a lot of people doing so many great things with it. I saw someone just add a dedicated D6, which means that every character starts with another active item, which is the D6, and that is tied to yet another button. And that is something that wasn't possible before. And maybe what you could do, even when we get a better music API, you could have your own playlist in the game, and depending on which button you press, maybe you could even change that playlist, or maybe just have a dedicated play and pause and maybe fast forward, or maybe go to the next track. And I think that would be really exciting to see, and something that's definitely in realms of possibility, at least in the upcoming few patches. With that said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope to see you next time.